So let's jump right in with Samuel 20. You should have read this before today, so we're not going to read it in class. It's one of the changes we made to kind of keep things moving a little bit quicker. But I am going to summarize. So if you didn't get a chance to read it, I will go over the key points here. So this is the beginning here. David goes to Jonathan. And sort of to pick up where we left off, what was the last thing that happened in chapter 19? To kind of get a running start. Or else I have David up there. It'd kind of be good to know what David's situation is at this moment in time. What was Saul trying to do at the end of chapter 19? Phrase it that way. What was that? That's right, trying to kill David, right? He had sent messengers to kill David. Do you remember why they failed? I know some of you were here last time. Why did the messengers and ultimately Saul, why did they all fail in their attempts to kill David in chapter 19? They started prophesying. They were overcome by God's power, and they started prophesying. And we don't know what they prophesied, but as Eddie pointed out last time, it was the word of God. So their attempt to kill David was thwarted, and instead they proclaimed the word of God. So that's the situation that David is in. Saul has now tried to kill him. The king has tried to kill him. And so now he goes to his friend Jonathan, the son of Saul, and he flees from Naioth in Ramah and goes to Jonathan and asks what he has done to deserve to be killed by Saul, which is, of course, nothing. We've been in this book for 19 chapters, and we know that David has done nothing to deserve death. So Jonathan tells David that Saul isn't trying to kill him, because if he was, Saul would have told Jonathan. And Saul did. This is something that Saul did do. In 19:1, Saul did tell his son that he was going to kill David, but Jonathan reasoned with Saul, and Saul agreed not to kill David, only to change his mind later in chapter 19 and to send messengers to kill David, as we just said. And Jonathan's sister, David's wife, Michal, was also aware her father was trying to kill David, but Jonathan seems not to know. Jonathan just seems that he does not realize that his father has now reneged on his promise not to harm David, because he's telling David, hey, my father's not trying to kill you. If he was trying to kill you, I would know. I'm his son. He doesn't keep secrets from me. But David tells Jonathan that Saul has realized that he has found favor in Jonathan's eyes, and Saul is therefore concealing his attempt to kill David from Jonathan. Jonathan tells David he'll do whatever David wants him to. And then verse 5, and David said to Jonathan, indeed, tomorrow is the new moon, and I should not fail to sit with the king and eat, but let me go, that I may hide in the field until the third day of evening. I wanted to stop here real briefly and explain this reference to the new moon, because this is something in our culture we may not understand. The new moon. The month is related to the word, world. I find a typo every time I read this. Word moon. Modern months average 1/12 of a year in length, so they are only approximately equal to the phase of the moon. But Jewish months started and ended with the new moon. And there were certain practices outlined for the beginning of the month. Numbers 10:10. And on the day of your gladness and in your solemn days and in the beginning of your months, you shall blow the trumpets over your burnt offerings and over the sacrifices of your peace offerings, that they may be to you for a memorial before God. I am the Lord your God. And also in Numbers 28:11, at the beginning of your months, you shall present a burnt offering to the Lord, 2 young bulls, 1 ram, and 7 lambs in their first year without blemish. 3/10 of an ephah of fine flour as a grain offering mixed with oil. For each bull, 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour as a grain offering mixed for 1 ram. Sorry, verse 13. Pick up with verse 13. And 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil as a grain offering for each lamb, as a burnt offering of sweet aroma, an offering made by fire to the Lord. Their drink offering shall be half a hin of wine for a bull, 1/3 of a hin for a ram, and 1/4 of a hin for a lamb. This is the burnt offering for each month throughout the month of the year. Also, 1 kid of the goats as a sin offering to the Lord shall be offered, besides the regular burnt offerings and drink offerings. Okay, I apologize, I fumbled that a little bit, but I think you get the point, right? We maybe don't care so much about the details, but at the beginning of the month, there was a number of special ordinances and offerings that were to be offered. So this is a special time in the calendar at the beginning of every month for the Israelites. And so David seems to strongly feel that he should eat with the king on these occasions. And he may feel that way because Saul feels that way. We're going to see a little bit later that Saul is upset when David doesn't show up to these meals at the beginning of the month. Okay. So this is David's request to Jonathan. If your father misses me at all, then say, David earnestly asked permission of me that he might run over to Bethlehem, his city, for there is a yearly sacrifice there for all the family. If he says thus, it is well, your servant will be safe. But if he is very angry, be sure that evil is determined by him. Therefore you shall deal kindly with your servant, for you have brought your servant into a covenant of the Lord with you. Nevertheless, if there is any iniquity in me, kill me yourself, for why should you bring me to your father? Okay, so David outlines three possibilities here that I want to go over. The first is, case one, Saul says it is well. So if Saul tells Jonathan it's well when he asks about David, then David will be safe. We saw that in the beginning of verse 7. Okay, case two, Saul is angry and intends to do evil. Okay, in this case, what's the outcome? What's that? What? Go ahead, you can answer. Yeah, he's probably going to kill him. He's going to be in some trouble. Okay. David expects Jonathan's protection because that means that he's going to kill him. Therefore, you shall deal kindly with your servant, for you have brought your servant into a covenant with the Lord. There's a third possibility. David is guilty of some iniquity. What should be the outcome if David is guilty of some iniquity? What's that? Kill me. You're right. Who kill me? Jonathan. Kill me yourself. He says, then David says Jonathan can kill him himself and not even get Saul involved. So David's attitude is, if I've done something worthy of death, we don't have to go to your dad. You can kill him. Okay, so these are the three possibilities. Let's see what happens. Jonathan agrees to talk to his father. Jonathan agrees that David will hide in the field, and Jonathan will talk to his father and send word to David of whether Saul intends good or evil toward him. They work out a scheme where Jonathan will shoot 3 arrows. If Jonathan tells the lad he sends to fetch the arrows, look, the arrows are on this side of you, then that's the message to David that he is safe. But if Jonathan tells the lad, look, the arrows are beyond you, then David should flee. Okay, so let's see how Saul reacts. We'll look at verses 24 through 33 here. David missed dinner on the first and second days of the month. So Saul asked Jonathan where David was. Jonathan tells his father the lie that they had concocted about Jonathan giving David permission to go to Bethlehem. Verse 30, then Saul's anger was aroused against Jonathan. He said to him, you son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, you shall not be established nor your kingdom. Now therefore send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die. And Jonathan answered Saul his father and said to him, why should he be killed? What has he done? Then Saul cast a spear at him to kill him, by which Jonathan knew that it was determined by his father to kill David. Okay, Saul's anger here. So, you son of a perverse, rebellious woman in verse 30. This may have just been a common insult of the day. It is, after all, basically the equivalent of the modern SOB. Or Saul may have literally been comparing Jonathan to his mother, the equivalent of turning to his wife and saying, he gets his disrespectful attitude from you. Either way, it shows Saul's extreme anger. He's dragging Jonathan's mother, his own wife, into this argument. Do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? I believe this reference to his mother's nakedness is a reference to Jonathan's conception and basically means his mother bore him for nothing. Are there any comments or questions so far? I haven't asked a lot of questions yet, so I want to give you a chance to jump in. Oh, Ben, go ahead.
Just that the word perverse comes up a lot in the Proverbs and Psalms. It's always it's clear the word to test perversion. Yeah. And I tried to hunt down like the etymology, like the root of it, to figure out if there was something there, and I couldn't find anything. But I'm also not like linguist.
Yeah, I understand.
But I mean, that word could have.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like the most detestable. Like God hates that.
Yeah, and I think this is New King James. I've always used the New King James up here, where it refers to as perverse, rebellious woman, but I think some translations just call her a whore. They just say, you son of a whore. Because it carries this very strong negative connotation when it says perverse there, when we look at the actual Hebrew word, apparently. Anything else? Okay. All right, so questions then. Why is Saul so angry at Jonathan? Yeah, David, go ahead.
You know, one of them is just that his own son has chosen David instead of extending his own line.
Yeah, so there's two things there. It's sort of, you're my son, why are you not on my side? But you hit the second thing there, extending his own line. What does that mean? What are we talking about, extending his own line? David or anybody? You brought it up, David. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, the kingly line, you know, continuing the, you know, I'm trying to say
Exactly.
dynasty.
David expects to be the founder, sorry, Saul expects to be the founder of a dynasty. David's going to get that privilege, right? And Samuel's made that clear that if Saul had been faithful to God, that he would not have just been the king of himself, but he would have been the beginning of a dynasty that's going to last in perpetuity. That's important to him, just as it's going to be important to David. David gets that privilege. That's why now we talk about Jesus being the son of David and the David dynasty still continuing in Jesus Christ. That was what Saul gave up through his disobedience. And even though it's his own fault, he is grasping at holding on to that power, not just for himself, but for his son and for his son's descendants. He wants them to sit on the throne after him forever. And Jonathan is not getting with the program. Jonathan is basically giving up the throne, and Saul thinks he's nuts. You know. Other thoughts, other answers, comments? So David is a threat to Saul's throne. Talked about that. David is a threat to the dynasty Saul has founded, and David is a threat to Jonathan's future on the throne. Okay, so why does Jonathan not share his father's concern? Does Jonathan not realize he will never sit on his father's throne? Ben, go ahead.
Just the amount of time that it says that he loved David much as he loved himself. When you care about someone as much as you care about yourself, what's good for them is good for you.
Yeah, so that's one of them. And I'm glad that one brought out because I think there are others, and that's maybe an easy one to mix. But part of it is Jonathan loves David. They're like, you know, best friends forever. So because of his love for David, he's not upset that David's blessing is coming at maybe a loss to himself. But I think there are other reasons. Go ahead, Dan.
Jonathan realized that God's he's not.
Right. If you couldn't hear that, Dan says God is in control. And we've seen it in the character of Jonathan that he looks to God's will, not his own. We saw that the first time Jonathan was introduced to us. We saw him having a victory over the Philistines where he chooses, remember this is when they hardly had any weapons. They couldn't get their weapons sharpened because the Philistines had always done their sharpening for them. And so they almost didn't have any swords. And David chooses to take a group of men over, and he says, if we get in a conflict with the Philistines, if it's the will of God that we fight the Philistines, then we're going to win. He has confidence in God, and he's willing to do he's willing to go where God leads him. And he knows that God is choosing David. I mean, basically everybody knows it. Saul knows it too, right? Samuel has told Saul that God is done with him. We've seen that Saul can kind of sense it. In the previous chapter or the one before it, it said that Saul felt that the Spirit of God had left him and was with David. So Saul knows what's happening. The people seem to know what's happening. Jonathan knows what's happening. They know this is from God. So godly people like Jonathan are accepting it. Saul is not. David, go ahead.
Yeah, another one is just David had promised Jonathan not to cut off his line.
Yeah.
You know, his offspring,
Yeah.
which is very not normal for kings
Yeah.
in that time period.
Yeah, they've made this mutual covenant to not only be good towards each other, but for their line to benefit each other's lines mutually. So there is this vow that he's made that he has to be responsible for. Ben, go ahead.
I was going to say, when you put mine and Dan's answers together, it sounds a lot like the two greatest commandments of the Lord your God, love your soul, mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You know, when you do those two things, a lot of things fall into place.
Yeah, absolutely. Both for the love of God and for the love of David, he is not going to join in his father's attempts to kill David. Other thoughts, other answers? Oh,
Do you
Kevin.
think it's public knowledge that Samuel took the kingdom away, or that through God's word took the kingdom away from Saul? Or
Okay.
is that something that was
Good question. I have some thoughts on that, but first, if you couldn't hear, here's Kevin's question to y'all. Is it public knowledge that Samuel, and therefore God, has taken the kingdom away from Saul and given it to David? I mean, so sort of get the ball rolling. Was it public knowledge when we saw Samuel anoint David? No, it was rather clandestine, right? Because God gave Samuel a cover story when he went to Bethlehem. He said, when you go to Bethlehem, take a heifer with you to sacrifice. So you don't have to tell them that you're there to anoint the new king. When they asked why you're there, what did Samuel say? He just said, I'm here to make sacrifice with Jesse. He left out the part that he was there to anoint one of Jesse's sons to be the new king. So initially, at least part of it was kept secret. Are there aspects of this, though, that are publicly known that we can see? I think there's at least one. The rift between Samuel and Saul, I think everybody knows about. That was a very public. He chastised Saul right in front of his face right after they'd won a great battle over the Philistines. It was when Saul had failed to kill King Agag, and Samuel had to do it, and he started to leave. And Saul didn't want, I think Saul wanted to avoid this big public rift. He begs him to stay. He does stay, but then he leaves at the end of that day, and he says, I'm not going to come to you again. So I think everybody knows that Samuel and Saul have a rift, and that Samuel does not come to offer counsel to Saul anymore. I don't know that they know specifically that a new king has been chosen, because that was done in secret, very intentionally done in secret. But as I just said a moment ago, people are sensing that God is with David. Saul's servants have seen it. They could tell that the distressing spirit that came upon Saul was from God, and they could tell that God was with David. So I think there's a lot of political tension, and I think people know that Saul and Samuel are on opposite sides, and I think people know whose side God is on, but it doesn't seem to be common knowledge that David is the one that God has selected to be the king. Go ahead, Kevin.
The reason I had a thought was because whenever David kills Goliath, the prince, Jonathan, gives him his sword and his clothes.
Yeah.
It's almost like he knows if he's not going to be the king, he gives it to him.
Okay, yeah, and that's a slightly different question, because publicly I don't think it's everybody knows, but I think Jonathan understands. And because Saul gets it, I mean, that's why Saul's so angry. He knows what's happening, and he knows Jonathan should know. That's why he's so mad at Jonathan. You know that David is going to usurp this dynasty that I have created for you. And Jonathan, so I think Jonathan does know that to a large extent. That's for the reasons we've seen, he just doesn't care. So for one thing, we saw Jonathan loves David. Jonathan knows David has done no wrong and will not kill an innocent for his own benefit. David is only destined to be king because of the will of God, and Jonathan puts God's will ahead of his own. Saul's story has been one of a godly man chosen by God to be king, a humble man who didn't seem to even want the job, but who has over time become disobedient to God, puts God's will second to his own, and now violently clings to power against the desire of God. And Jonathan is not like that. Jonathan is a man who still wants to follow God, even if his father does not. Okay, so David has to flee. See how we're doing on time. No, pretty good. Jonathan sends a message to David, as they had planned, with the arrows. Jonathan meets David outside the city before David flees. Jonathan reminds David that they have sworn, may the Lord be between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever. David brought that up a moment ago. That was in 42. And David flees, and Jonathan returns to the city. Okay, so that sets us up for the story of David and the showbread, the beginning of chapter 21. Another chapter we were supposed to read, so I'm just going to go ahead and jump in with a little summary. David arrives in Nob and goes to Ahimelech, the priest. And Ahimelech, just for your reference, is the son of Ahitub, the son of Phinehas, the son of Eli. So we saw Eli back in chapter 1. He was high priest then. Not a great high priest, apparently, godly in a lot of ways, but put up with the disobedience of his son Phinehas and Phinehas' brother. And they all get killed in battle as a result. But Phinehas had other children, or had children, and one of them, Ahitub, becomes the father of Ahimelech, and Ahimelech is now priest. Okay. Ahimelech is alarmed that David is traveling alone, but David claims to be on a secret mission for the king, and that he has sent his men. Oh my goodness. I found typos this morning. I still find more. His God has sent his men, not his men, his men to another place. He then asks Ahimelech for 5 loaves of bread, or if he doesn't have 5 loaves of bread, then whatever he does have, he wants. Okay. The priest has no common bread, but only holy bread. but offers it to David and his men. If David and his men have kept themselves from women, David said he and his men have been kept from women for 3 days, and claims the bread is in effect common, even though it has been consecrated. And I have no idea why he says that. If anyone has any thoughts on that, you can offer them. I could not find a commentary that explained by what logic David thinks that he can say, well, the holy bread, it's common, really, if you think about it, because this is not something they made up. Okay, and Ahimelech does give David the showbread. Okay, so let's talk about the showbread. Okay, the last time we saw the Ark of the Covenant was in chapter 7, right? This was after the Philistines had captured it, and then it moved all around the Philistines because they didn't want to deal with the problems that were following it with the plagues. It comes back to Israel, moves around a little bit, and settles in Kiriath Jearim, where it apparently remained for many years. And presumably the tabernacle was pitched there also, because you shouldn't have the tabernacle, you shouldn't have the ark somewhere where you don't have the tabernacle to put it in. Okay, by this time, the tabernacle appears to have been moved to Nob, because the showbread, it's also spelled with an S-H-E-W, was to sit on a table in the tabernacle before the ark. Here's what it said in Exodus. You shall also make a table of acacia wood, 2 cubits shall be its length, a cubit's width, and a cubit and a half its height. And you shall overlay it with pure gold and make a molding of gold all around. You shall make for it a frame and a handbreadth all around. And you shall make a gold molding for the frame all around. And you shall make for it 4 rings of gold and put the rings on the 4 corners that are at its 4 legs. The rings shall be close to the frame as holders for the poles to bear the table. And you shall make the poles of acacia wood and overlay them with gold, that the table may be carried with them. You shall make its dishes, its pans, its pitchers, and its bowls for pouring. You shall make them of pure gold, and you shall set the showbread on the table before me always. So there's nothing common about this meal, right? This gold plate on a gold table with bread that is for God, and it's supposed to sit before him always as they perpetually change it out. You do change it out, so somebody's got to eat it. But it was to be the priest of Aaron. Leviticus 24, and you shall take fine flour and bake 12 cakes with it, 2 tens. Let's skip down to verse 9. You guys don't care how to make this bread. And it shall be for Aaron and his sons, and they shall eat it in a holy place, for it is most holy to him, the offerings of the Lord made by fire, by a perpetual statute. So this is why I'm confused personally by David's comment that it's basically common, because what God says is it's most holy. Okay. And Goliath's sword is also there. We learn that Doeg the Edomite, the chief herdsman of Saul, was there. This will be important a little later. David has fled from Saul without a weapon, so he asks the priest if there's a sword there. They only have the sword of Goliath, the Philistine, which David takes. And I don't know, that emoji is because I tried to put verse 9 there, and it looks like it converted to an emoji without me noticing it. And this was the sword. We skipped over chapter 17, basically. We touched on it briefly, because that's the chapter I thought everybody was aware of. But we all know that David slew Goliath with a sling, but then afterwards he takes Goliath's sword, cuts Goliath's head off with it, and then keeps it. And it's wound up here with the priest of Nob, and now it's given to David so that he will have a sword. And David flees to Gath. So any questions over the showbread? Yeah.
Jesus brings it up
Yeah.
several times in one different
Yeah.
gospel. He brings it up.
What does he say? Does he say it was okay to eat?
Well, I was looking back. It's hard to say. It doesn't really say that he's removed it, but he's definitely using it as a weaponized against the Pharisees
Yeah.
who are trying to, say don't do these things on Sabbath. It's unclear.
I think when he starts, though, I think at the beginning he says David ate the showbread, which it was not lawful for him to eat. And then what he goes on to say is sometimes interpreted in such a way that he's sort of maybe on David's side. But I do think at the very beginning, he starts his argument, Jesus starts the argument by saying, which was not lawful for David to eat. So.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, he's using it for his
Yeah,
own.
yeah,
Say,
yeah.
like, the ones that can, like,
Yeah.
it's a new temple
Yeah,
now. So
yeah,
it's holding in the
yeah,
place.
yes, yeah.
But that's on that side.
Yeah.
of Jesus, so I don't know
Yeah.
how
But he does go on to say that there are things more important than sacrifice, right? And yeah, I think it's difficult to make a case that David was supposed to eat this bread. But Jesus does use this illustration. But it was something, I think Jesus brings it up because the Pharisees, I don't think, had a big problem with David eating this bread.
Right, exactly.
But they had a problem with Jesus, right? They had 2 different standards, one for David and one for Jesus.
Clearly, it was just a significant enough event that,
Yeah.
like, how many centuries later people are still talking about.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's going to be a fall. It's like a sequel to the story, right? We make it to today, we make it to next week. So let's look in the rest of chapter 21. David flees to Gath. David flees to Gath, where I'm trying to write these down. Where Achish is king. Usually the city leaders are called lords. So Achish is not really a sense of the king. He's one of the lords of the 5 cities of the Philistines. We've seen Gath mentioned before, because early in the book, when we're talking about the ark being moved around the Philistine territory, we saw that they had 5 cities. Each city had its own lord. Whenever they made decisions, they kind of got together and did it collectively. No one of them ruled all of the Philistine territory. In this case, Achish is described as a king, but he's really just a lord of the city. Gash is one of the 5 cities of the Philistines. Again, you can see that in chapter 6. And Goliath, incidentally, was from Gath. So Achish not only recognizes David, he describes him as king of the land, citing what apparently has become a very well-known song. We've seen this song before. Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. Apparently Achish sees the same thing in the song that Saul saw. David has eclipsed Saul in the people's eyes, making David a threat to Saul. Okay, Achish's words make David afraid, so he pretends to be crazy by scratching on the gates and drooling from his mouth. So Achish tells his servants he does not want David in his house, and David departs, but he will seek refuge in Gath again in chapter 27. So he and Achish are not done. They're going to wind up aligning themselves together later. So why did I put that? I don't want that in here. Okay, so why does David pretend to be crazy? I can't put the slide up. Just remember the question. And I think it's a very difficult question. And the commentaries that I looked at kind of skip over this. So I'm kind of interested in your thoughts. I have a couple of thoughts, but I'm kind of interested in yours because I don't know that I really know. He's afraid. That's the immediate thing. He's afraid. But how does being crazy, how does that help?
You're not afraid, crazy.
Okay, maybe because he's not a threat. So maybe they see David as a threat. David has killed a lot of Philistines, including hometown hero Goliath. So maybe they want to kill him. But if he's crazy, he's no threat. That's one possibility. Other thoughts? Let's see. Let me just put everything up here. So I just mentioned Psalm 34, the superscription of Psalm of David, when he pretended madness for Abimelech, who drove him away when he departed. I read Psalm 34. I don't think it really helps explain why he feigned madness. It's a psalm from that time, but it didn't really shed any light in my eyes on why it is. Abimelech in Psalm 34 is talking about Achish, by the way. Abimelech means my father is king and is likely a title instead of a name. The king's name is Achish in 1 Samuel. Psalm 34 does not, to me, shed any light on David's motives, but it does suggest that David survived because of God. And this was the only thing, I meant to hide this comment until I had some discussion, but let me throw it up. The text does not actually say what David feared. Now, you said he feared for his life, Kevin. That's how I read it initially, but I'm not sure that we can assume that. Rather than fearing death, David may have feared being made a pawn of Achish, and by feigning madness, he made himself appear useless to Achish and in fact a danger to him. So there's a couple of thoughts. Maybe by pretending to be crazy, he convinced Achish that he was no threat to the Philistines. Maybe Achish saw that he could use David to his political advantage against Saul. And again, by framing madness, that became useless. Any ideas or thoughts beyond that? What we expressed so far? Okay. So we'll just go ahead and move on. So 400 men joined David at the beginning of chapter 22. David goes to Adullam, which is in Judah. It's about 13 or 14 miles from Bethlehem, where he lives in a cave. So it's about 13 or 14 miles from where David is from. So you could walk there in a day or less. When David's brothers receive word where he is, they and the rest of Jesse's household go to see David. Verse 2, and everyone was in distress. Everyone who was in debt and everyone who was discontented gathered to him. So he became captain over them, and there were about 400 men with him. And David goes to Mizpah, which means watchtower of Moab, and asks the king, please let my father and mother come here with you till I know what God will do for me. Now, Mizpah means watchtower. This is not the city of Mizpah, which was mentioned in chapter 7 and 10, but a fortress in Moab. And Moab is another one of the neighboring nations Saul led the Israelites in battle against, mentioned in chapter 14, verse 47, as are the Philistines. So this makes two enemies that David has fled to. But the prophet Gad tells David to return to Judah, so that David went to the forest of Hereth. Okay, let's look at some questions. Why does David listen to Gad? I mean, we don't know how long he stayed, but it doesn't seem like he was very long in Moab. He went there because he felt safe. Gad says, I'll go back to Israel. And he does it. Why? Why does he care what Gad has to say? Right. If he recognizes him as a prophet of God, he's going to listen to him. And specifically, look, what did David just say? David said he was only staying in Moab until he knew what God was going to do for him, and Gad was a prophet of God. True to his word, when David learns God's will for him, he departed where God wanted him to go. Let's back up. See that in I thought I'd quoted it, but I had not. In that verse where he explains what he's bringing his parents there, he says, I'm only here until I learn God's will for me. Well, now he's learned God's will for him, and so he's going to do it. So why does David keep fleeing to Israel's enemies? David has quite a reputation as a warrior who slays men in the armies of these neighboring nations for Saul. So why is David fleeing to these people now?
Saul was his, at this point, Saul was his enemy, and Saul was there.
Yeah, they have a common enemy, right? Saul has become David's enemy to the point that Saul wants David dead. So there is an element, I think, of the enemy of my enemy is my friend here. Other reasons. Yeah, you're not going to look for him. Specifically, he's not in Israel, right? I don't think he's safe. He doesn't feel safe anywhere in Israel. Again, this comes back to Saul trying to kill him. Saul can get to him anywhere in Israel. You either can't look for him if he's there, or even if you know he's there, he's out of reach. So even though there may be some dangers to David in these other nations where they've been at war with frequently, at least he's out of the reach of Saul, which is his primary concern right now. Other thoughts? It shows David is not safe in Israel. In other nations, at least, he is safe from Saul, as we just said. Israel had periods of peace with their neighbors. So because this text is highlighting the battles, it may be easy to overlook the fact that it's just not a constant state of war. And we see that in a couple things. They enjoyed commerce with them. Again, we saw that back in, I think, chapter 15, but don't quote me on that, where we learned that the reason there's a shortage of sharp weapons among the Israelites is they went to the Philistines for all their sharpening. If you had a piece of farm equipment that needed sharpening, you went to the Philistines, paid them to do it. Right? So they're not just constantly at each other's throats. They are conducting business with one another, and they sometimes adopted their religious practices. Now, this was wrong, of course, right? But Bob asked the question last week, why did they even have an idol in David's house that they could put in the bed to pretend was David? Why was it even there? Earlier, we saw when Samuel commanded the people to get rid of their Baals and their Ashtoreths. These were small idols of a god and goddess of the Philistines, and a ton of the Israelites were keeping them in their house. Now, that was wrong, but the fact that they had them at all shows that there's enough peaceful contact between the two groups that they are picking up pieces of each other's culture. So there's probably not just a constant nonstop fighting between the two groups. So that may have something to do with it. And David may have felt, as we said, the enemy of his enemy was his friend. And in chapter 27, David will return to Gath and ally himself with Achish, showing that the two men were mutually beneficial to each other. Okay. So at this particular time, and I'm kind of skipping back to the Philistine example here, but even though in the previous example where he goes to Gath, clearly he decided once he got there, he decided he needed to get out of there. It wasn't wrong to think that Achish could be beneficial to him. They will work out a situation where they can ally themselves later on in the story. Okay, So why is David's initial army made up of the distressed, those in debt, and the discontented? Doesn't sound like much of an army. Or is it? Why are these the people that joined David's cause?
Well, they're similar to him. The fact that he has this friction between.
Yeah, they're distressed because of Saul. So yeah, there's a commonality of purpose here, right? Saul is sort of their enemy too. Saul's not trying to kill them, but these are people that Saul is causing distress. So yeah, very.
Parallel. Jesus is being too.
How so?
Well, distress and death and everything. You know, people are coming to Christ.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we need.
That's a great point. I noticed that too, and I was struggling with how to kind of make an illustration out of that, but that's jumped out at me as well. If you couldn't hear it, he's talking about there's a parallel with Christ. These are a lot of the same people you see coming to Christ. If you go to Luke or Matthew and look at the Beatitudes, you know, blessed are the poor, blessed are those who hunger, blessed are those who thirst. So Christ's kingdom is initially made up of those as well who are distressed, indebted. We're all indebted, right? Those are the people who turn to God, and you see a similar amount of people turn to Christ. You see a similar kind of people being the first ones to join up with David. Other reasons. Yeah, these are the people who are suffering under Saul's reign, and they are just the most natural ones to be willing to fight to oppose him. Go ahead, David.
Well, the showbread was the only bread left.
Yeah.
In this situation, Saul just got to take what's there.
Yeah, that's a great point. If you couldn't hear what David said, he ate the showbread because it was all that was available. This is what's available. He's hiding in a cave. You know, he's going to take what he can get. And what he can get at this point is 400 distressed, indebted, and discontented individuals. Excellent. Okay, so let's jump back to the showbread. Saul murders the priest. Oh yeah, we got just a few minutes. When Saul heard that David and the men who were with him had been discovered, now Saul was staying in Gibeah under a tamarisk tree in Ramah, and his spear in his hand, and all his servants standing about him. Then Saul said to his servants who stood about him, "Hear now, you Benjamites, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards and make you all captains and thousands and captains of hundreds? All of you have conspired against me, and there is no one who reveals to me that my son has made a covenant with the son of Jesse, and there is not one of you who is sorry for me or reveals to me that my son has stirred up my servants against me to lie in wait as it is this day." So this is a very tense situation for Saul's servants. Saul has learned that his son Jonathan is working against him, and he blames his servants for not telling him. Now, Saul knew Jonathan was working with David back in chapter 20, verse 30, but he may have not realized the full extent of Jonathan's loyalty to David. He does not apparently didn't know about this vow they'd made to each other. Some of his servants apparently knew, and he has found out, and he's mad that they didn't tell him. He speaks to his servants holding a spear. Everyone here would have been aware that Saul has hurled a spear in anger at David at least twice, maybe 3 times, depending on how you read it, and his own son Jonathan once. So the king is mad at you. The king who has a reputation for chucking spears at people he loves when he's angry with them is walking in front of you with a spear, telling you what a bad job you've been doing. So these guys are probably very, very nervous. One of them is Doeg the Edomite, who we noted was there when the priest gave David the showbread. He was Saul's chief herdsman, and he saw David when he was in Nob. Tells Saul how Ahimelech the priest gave David bread and Goliath's sword. Saul summons Ahimelech and his father's house Saul summons Ahimelech and his father's house, the priests who were in Nob. Saul accuses Ahimelech of conspiring with David, but Ahimelech points out that he had no reason to distress David. He says in verse 14, "So Ahimelech answered the king and said, 'And who among all your servants is as faithful as David? Who is the king's son-in-law who goes at your bidding and is honorable in your house, that I then begin to inquire of God for him? Far be it from me. Let not the king impute anything to his servant or to any of the house of my father, for your servant knew nothing of all this, little or much.'" Okay, so Saul ordered, so you can see Ahimelech's point here. He's like, David's one of your best servants, right? When you send him out to kill Philistines, he goes and kills Philistines. When you said, "You can have my daughter as your wife if you go get me 100 foreskins the Philistines. David just went and did it, brought in 200, killed 200 Philistines in order to marry his daughter. He is a faithful servant of Saul. They first came together right when they needed someone to play the harp for Saul because Saul was distressed. And they found David. It was David's harp playing that was giving Saul peace. So David has been nothing but faithful and beneficial to Saul and has even married the king's daughter. And so Ahimelech brings all this up. This is one of your most faithful servants, and he's your son-in-law. Why was I not supposed to trust him when he came to me? But Saul orders the guards to kill the priest, but none of Saul's servants would harm the priest, except for Doeg, who killed 85 priests. And then he attacked Nob, verse 19. Also Nob, the city of the prophets, he struck with the edge of the sword both men and women, children and nursing infants, oxen and donkeys and sheep with the edge of the sword. Okay. So why does Saul kill the priests and people of Nob? We're running out of time, so let's kind of move forward. Saul reminds me of the quote from Catch-22. Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they aren't after you. Saul is becoming paranoid and sees enemies everywhere, but Saul does in fact, I misspelled Saul. Saul does in fact have enemies everywhere. So who have we already seen turn against Saul? Samuel, right? We mentioned that earlier. Very public spat. They don't speak anymore between the prophet Samuel and Saul. Who else?
Son and his daughter.
His son as his daughter, right? Jonathan has taken David's side. His daughter Michal has taken Jonathan's side and helped her husband escape when Saul tried to kill him. God, that's the big one. God has turned against Saul. Anyone else? We still got 5 minutes, so don't feel like we have to rush. We're almost to the end of chapter 22, and that's where we'll stop. So any questions or comments, feel free. Let's see, I got a couple. I think I've got the ones. So Samuel, who publicly separated himself from Saul and secretly anointed David as a new king. Jonathan, who's made a vow with David. Michal, who helped her husband escape. What about the 400 distressed, indebted, and discontented men who have now formed an army with David as their captain? In general, the people are celebrating David more than Saul. I'm not saying that they've turned against Saul, but the people are looking to David as a greater hero now, and that kind of plays into this. And David has tried to be loyal to Saul, but he has still accepted the anointing as a king by Samuel. So in a sense, I think David is against Saul. And then the best answer, God, right? God's the one that put all this in motion. God is the one that told Samuel that he was not going to let Saul continue to be king. So that's the ultimate problem that Saul has, is that God has turned against him. Okay, and so finishing up this chapter real quick. Now, one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named, I try to write these down. Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the Lord's priest. So David said to Abiathar, I knew that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul, I have caused the death for all the persons in your father's house. Stay with me, do not fear. For he who seeks my life seeks your life, but with me you shall be safe. So add one more to the list. One more person who has now turned against Saul. I don't know if we can really answer this question, but I just wonder if anyone had any thoughts on if David was responsible for the deaths of the people of Nob. He feels he is. What do you think? Do you think David is responsible for their deaths? No, why not? Saul was responsible. Okay, so why does David feel responsible? He kind of set it in motion, right? If his actions had been different, those people would have been alive. But as Dan said, he's still not responsible for Saul's actions. So I can see why he's saying, if I'd only done things differently, right? But I agree with you. I don't see where David is really responsible. Go ahead, Dan.
I like the second thing.
Yeah. It shows, if you couldn't hear, it shows David's compassion in contrast to Saul. So real quick, one more slide. Saul's attempts to hold on to the throne are backfiring. These are the thoughts I'll leave you with. David has been forced to oppose Saul because Saul is trying to kill him. This is not what David wants. David wants to be a faithful soldier and harp player. He's not trying to actively fight against Saul, but his hand has been forced by Saul's own attempts to kill David. Jonathan is a loyal son, but is forced to oppose his father because killing David would be a sin. And 400 men have already joined David because they have been alienated by Saul. So this is sort of the story we see of Saul. Saul wants to hold on to the kingdom, but it's just slipping away from him. But everything he does to hold on to it is just what's causing the process of him ultimately losing it to continue in motion. He has all of these enemies because in his fear of losing the kingdom, he's created these enemies. And these are the enemies that are ultimately going to take him off the throne. Because his army is only going to get bigger. It's not going to stay 400 men. Other thoughts, comments? Okay, so since we got through 22 today, normally we're kind of flexible. But since I want to hand it over to Brian on a fixed place, we'll plan on doing chapters 23 and 24 next time. Read them both. If we get to 20, if we finish early, we'll stop at 24. We won't go to 25, so we have a clean break point, and we'll make sure to cover all those chapters next time. Thank you.